Hello, explorers. Welcome back to the Accidental Explorer.
Guarantees, and you think they're set in stone.
Right. Like bedrock.
Exactly.
Mm.
But then when questions arise about whether they're actually being delivered on, well, it kind of shakes things up.
It really does.
So that's what we're diving into today. We're looking at Nagaland, specifically its autonomy within the Indian Constitution. Article 371A is the key piece here.
And the big question really is, has the Constitution actually lived up to that promise? You know, the promise to protect Nagaland's unique identity.
That's the core of it. Our sources for this deep dive, they get into Article 371A itself. Then there's the Shillong Accord.
Which was pretty controversial.
Yeah, and then the sort of disillusionment that seems to have followed in Nagaland.
So we're basically mapping out the promise, a major turning point, and then, well, the fallout, you could say.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning then. Nagaland becomes the 16th state of India. That was 1963.
1963, yeah. But the thing is, it wasn't just like standard procedure. There were very specific conditions laid down.
Like a special agreement.
Pretty much. That's where Article 371A comes in. It wasn't just copied and pasted. It was written specifically for Nagaland.
And the point was?
Well, the point was to recognize that Nagaland had its own distinct history, its own identity, separate from, you know, the broader Indian state at the time.
So this Article 371A gives some specific protections.
Exactly. Carves out 4 key areas. Basically, it says no act of parliament applies to Nagaland concerning 1, religion,
Okay.
2, Naga customary law and procedure, 3, ownership and transfer of land,
Big ones.
huge, and 4, the resources within Nagaland. Crucially, none of these central laws apply unless the Nagaland Legislative Assembly explicitly consents.
So it's more than just consultation. It's actual consent, like a veto power.
That was the idea, yeah. A shield, basically, around these fundamental parts of Naga life and identity.
A way to keep that distinct identity intact within the Indian Union.
Precisely. That was the intent. To respect their history, their social structures, and keep control over those core elements with their own elected representatives.
But as we hinted, our sources suggest that SHIELD hasn't maybe been as strong in practice.
Yeah, this is where it gets murky. The effectiveness of the article seems to have, well, worn down over the years.
How so? Is it being ignored or?
It's more about interpretation, it seems. Like, the words are there, but how they're applied by the central government versus how Nagaland understands them.
Huh.
So there seems to be a growing gap.
So the Union government and Nagaland might read the same article, but come to different conclusions about what it means for, say, a new national law.
That's the argument presented in the sources, yeah.
Yeah.
And we see examples where central laws or big projects seem to have gone ahead in Nagaland in ways that, according to some, appear to bypass that need for the state assembly's explicit consent on those protected subjects.
Okay, can you give us an example, something concrete?
Sure. Oil exploration is one that comes up.
Right. Resources, that's one of the 4 points.
Exactly. The argument is that exploration activities have moved forward without that clear consent from the Nagaland Assembly regarding, you know, the actual ownership and control of those resources.
Which Article 371A says requires their okay?
Correct. Then there's the extension of central taxation laws. That's another area cited where the autonomy seems to have been chipped away at.
So it's like maybe not a direct attack on Article 371A itself, but finding ways around it.
That's kind of the picture painted. The interpretation leans towards the union's priorities, maybe sidelining Nagaland-specific safeguards.
And you mentioned the Uniform Civil Code debate. How does that fit in?
Well, that's seen as a potential major threat, because remember, Naga customary law is explicitly protected.
Right. Point 2.
So the idea of a uniform code potentially overriding those customary laws, possibly without the Assembly's consent, raises huge concerns in Nagaland.
Yeah, I can see why. It feels like a direct challenge to one of the core protections.
It does, and it feeds into this perception, this feeling that the important decisions about Nagaland's future, its identity, are increasingly being made, you know, far away in New Delhi, not in Kohima.
Despite the article specifically designed to prevent that.
Exactly. The spirit of the article, which was about empowerment, feels diluted by these practical realities and the assertion of central authority.
And this feeling, this maybe growing mistrust, that probably sets the stage for the Shillong Accord. Right?
Yeah.
1975. You said it was controversial.
Hugely controversial. Yeah, the Shillong Accord was basically an agreement between the Indian government and certain Naga leaders, not all of them.
Okay, what did it say?
The core points were that these leaders agreed to give up the armed struggle and, crucially, accept the Indian Constitution.
On the face of it, sounds like peace. Ending the violence?
Well, yes, but that's where the division comes in. For many in the Naga nationalist movement, accepting the Indian constitution without a resolution on, the fundamental issue of sovereignty
Was seen as giving up.
Exactly. It was seen as a surrender, a betrayal by some leaders. They felt the core demand hadn't been addressed. This disagreement basically split the movement.
And that's the origin of the NSCN, the National Socialist Council of Nagaland.
That's right. They completely rejected the Shillong Accord. They argued the fight wasn't over, that Naga self-determination was still the goal, and laying down arms under those terms was, well, unacceptable.
So the Accord, instead of unifying, actually deepened the fractures.
In many ways, yes. The feeling, as reflected in the sources, was that India was kind of dictating the terms, not negotiating in good faith on the core political issues. It just added another layer of complexity and mistrust.
Which then leads us to this really stark situation. Nagaland has Article 371A, this special status, but it's also lived under AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, for decades. How does that even work?
It's a massive contradiction, isn't it? And it really gets to the heart of the question. What does autonomy mean if it exists alongside, essentially, military rule?
Can you just quickly remind us what AFSPA allows?
Sure. In designated disturbed areas, AFSPA gives the armed forces really wide-ranging powers. Things like shooting on suspicion, arresting people without warrants.
And impunity, right. Limited accountability.
Significant impunity, yes. That's a key aspect. So you have 371A supposedly protecting the civilian cultural sphere, and then you have AFSPA, which can override basic legal protections and gives immense power to the military. They seem completely at odds.
Yeah, it feels like two different realities operating in the same place.
And the sources really emphasize the human rights impact of AFSPA. Tragedies like the Oding massacre in Mon District are cited as, horrific examples of what can happen.
I remember that. It was awful.
And beyond the big incidents, there are these ongoing worries about disappearances, about unreported abuses. It just fundamentally clashes with the idea of constitutional autonomy.
So the question raised is just so potent. How can you have genuine autonomy under what some describe as perpetual military occupation?
It really forces you to think about the limits of constitutional guarantees when they exist alongside laws like AFSPA. It suggests, for many in Nagaland, a big gap between the promise on paper and the reality on the ground.
So bringing it to today, what are the sort of everyday challenges Nagas face in trying to live out this autonomy, even with 371A still technically there?
Well, the sources point to quite a few areas. Culture, for instance. There's a concern that the mainstream Indian education system doesn't really give much space to Naga history or perspectives.
But your own history gets sidelined.
That's the feeling, which over time can subtly erode cultural identity,
Yeah, makes sense. And what about the economic side? Land and resources again.
Absolutely central. Land is so tied to identity there, and the sources mention mining companies potentially operating without real local consent, or even the state assembly's okay, despite Article 371A.
Even though land and resources are specifically mentioned in the article.
Right, so it raises questions about who's really in control, who benefits.
And language. That must be another area.
Yeah, definitely. You have all these distinct Naga languages, but often official exams, government services, they prioritize Hindi or English.
Which creates barriers for people.
Huge barriers, yeah. Access to jobs, education, just participating fully, it impacts linguistic autonomy.
So it's like a constant low-level pressure on culture, land, language.
Yeah.
The very things 371A was meant to protect.
Pretty much. And this seems to be fueling a growing sense of alienation, especially among younger Nagas, even the educated urban ones.
They feel the promise hasn't been kept.
That's the sense you get from the sources. They feel that integration into India was supposed to come with respect for their identity, and they're not seeing it fully realized, which leads to this kind of dialogue of the deaf.
How so?
Well, you have Delhi saying maybe implicitly, look, you've got Article 371A, what more do you need? And in Nagaland, the question is more like, okay, we have it on paper, but what has it actually protected? What does our future really look like?
That really captures the gap, doesn't it, between the letter of the law and the lived experience. So looking ahead, what are the different ideas floating around in Nagaland about the way forward?
It's not monolithic, for sure. The sources show a spectrum. Some people are calling for basically a renegotiation of the whole deal. Like, let's revisit the terms of statehood, clarify 371A's power in today's world.
Okay, strengthen the existing framework.
Sort of. Others, though, are still focused on the idea of Naga sovereignty, arguing that real self-determination can only happen outside the current Indian constitutional setup.
The original goal for some parts of the movement.
Exactly. And then there's a significant group pushing for India to simply genuinely respect Article 371A as it was intended, make the existing promises real.
So different paths, but it sounds like underlying all of them is a need for something more than just legal changes.
Absolutely. The sources stress this idea of political honesty. Genuine consultation, real respect, not just going through the motions.
And removing AFSPA, is that still a major demand?
Oh, constantly. It's seen as absolutely crucial, a basic first step to build any kind of trust and show respect for rights and, well, normal civilian life.
It really seems to come back to this core idea. Nagaland's identity, their aspirations. They need more than just words in the Constitution to feel secure.
Yeah, the feeling is that the framework itself, whatever it is, has to genuinely listen and respect their unique position, their history. Otherwise,
Otherwise, the sense of identity might just look for expression elsewhere.
that's the underlying suggestion, yes. That identity and self-determination are powerful forces, and if the current structure doesn't accommodate them respectfully, they might, well, transcend it.
Wow. Okay, so we've really covered a lot of ground here. From the initial promise of Article 371A through the erosion, the Shillong Accord, the AFSPA paradox, right up to the current challenges and future perspectives.
It's definitely complex. You've got history, law, politics, human rights all tangled together.
And it forces us to think hard about what constitutional safeguards really mean in practice, especially for unique cultural groups within a bigger nation. Are the promises being kept? How are they perceived?
Yeah, it's not just an academic question, is it? It has real-world consequences.
Absolutely. And it leaves us with this this kind of lingering thought, doesn't it? This idea that maybe autonomy isn't just something that's granted.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe, as these sources seem to hint, it's something that sometimes has to be constantly asserted, defended, maybe even reclaimed by the people themselves.
A powerful thought, yeah, about the dynamics between identity, law, and that fundamental drive for self-determination.
Definitely something to chew on.